Hey there, my name is Noah. I'm 24 and I was born and raised in a small town in Nebraska. But a few months ago, I moved to a quiet suburb in Colorado to start fresh. Life back home was messy, and I needed a change. I work as a mechanic at a local shop. It's not glamorous, but I love fixing things. There's something honest about it. You see what's broken, get your hands dirty, and make it right. When I first got here, I didn't know a soul. Most nights, it was just me, my small rental house, a frozen pizza, and the hum of cars passing by. I wasn't looking for anything special. I figured life would come together slowly, piece by piece, like an old engine. But sometimes life throws you a curveball when you're not ready. It happened one Saturday afternoon. The sun was beating down, and the air was thick with humidity from a morning rain. I was walking back from the hardware store, carrying a bag of tools for a side project. That's when I saw her. She was in the yard 2 houses down from mine. A woman, kneeling by a flower bed, wrestling with a stubborn garden hose that had sprung a leak. Water was spraying everywhere, soaking her jeans and t-shirt, but she kept at it, determined. I probably would have kept walking. I didn't want to seem like the nosy neighbor. But something about her made me pause. She looked frustrated, sure, but there was more to it, a heaviness, like she was carrying something much bigger than a busted hose. Need help? I called out, holding up my tool bag as a peace offering. She looked up, a bit startled. Her eyes were a deep green, and for a moment she just stared, like she was deciding whether to trust me or tell me to get lost. Then she nodded slowly. Yeah, she said, her voice soft and tired. That'd be great. I crossed the yard and knelt beside her. It was a quick fix. Tightened the connector, stopped the leak. Easy enough, I said, handing the hose back. She gave me a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thanks, she said. No problem, I replied, wiping my hands on my jeans. I'm Noah, by the way. Just moved in down the street. She hesitated for a moment before saying, Emma? We stood there awkwardly for a second. She fidgeted with the hose, like she wasn't sure whether to say more or just head back inside. I glanced over my shoulder, trying to give her an out. If you ever need anything fixed around here, I'm pretty handy, I said. Just give a shout. Emma nodded, but I could tell she wasn't the type to ask for help easily. She had this air of pride, but also something deeply wounded. As I turned to leave, I caught the glint of something on her left hand. A wedding ring. My chest tightened a little. I didn't know her story, but you didn't need to be a genius to sense something was off. No man around. Pain in her eyes. The way she seemed half-present, like part of her was somewhere else entirely. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place. As I walked back to my house, I glanced over my shoulder. She was still standing there, hose limp in her hands, watching me go. She gave a faint smile. This time, a real one, small and almost shy, but genuine. That night, as I sat on my back patio with a cold beer, listening to crickets, I couldn't stop thinking about that smile. It was lonely, but it hinted at how life could unexpectedly bring 2 broken people together. I didn't know it then, but that tiny crack in the door was the start of something unexpected. The next few days went by quietly. Emma and I crossed paths a few times from a distance, a wave here, a nod there, while she tended her garden, pulling weeds or carrying groceries inside. I didn't want to push it. You could feel it in the air around her. This heavy grief that didn't invite company. Still, something about her pulled me in every time I passed her house. Maybe it was the way she moved, like she was dragging invisible chains. Or maybe it was that small smile she gave me that first day, which stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. One evening, just before dusk, I saw her struggling again. She was trying to fix one of the front steps leading up to her porch. The wood looked rotted through, a hazard if she kept using it. She was crouched down, hammer in hand, looking frustrated and overwhelmed. I hesitated for half a second before crossing the street. Hey, I called out. You're gonna hurt yourself doing that. She looked up, brushing hair from her face with the back of her hand. It's fine, she said, almost on reflex. But it wasn't. Let me help, I said, setting down my tool bag before she could protest. Honestly, 2 hands are better than 1. This time, she didn't argue. She just stepped aside and sat on the top step, pulling her knees to her chest, watching me work in silence. The step was a simple fix. A few boards, a handful of nails, but I could feel her eyes on me the whole time, heavy and sad. You do this for a living? She asked quietly. Sort of, I said, flashing a small smile. Mechanic. Grew up fixing anything that needed fixing. Guess it stuck. She nodded, tugging her sleeve over her hand like she was cold, even though the Colorado evening was still warm. When I finished, I stood and wiped the sweat from my forehead. They're good as new. Should hold you for a while. I figured that was it. Another small moment. Another polite thank you. Another walk back to my place. But then she surprised me. Want some lemonade? She asked, her voice almost hesitant. I just made some. I smiled. Sure, sounds great. Inside her house, the air was cooler, but the silence was heavier. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the absence of life, like the house itself was holding its breath. The living room was neat, but little details told a story. A folded American flag in a glass case on the mantel. A wedding photo of Emma with a man in uniform, both of them glowing, young, and full of life. His arm was wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Emma caught me looking at the photo. That's my husband, she said, setting 2 glasses on the coffee table. Her voice cracked on the last word. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I started. She nodded, staring at her hands. Car accident. 6 weeks ago. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to that? Nothing felt like enough. Instead of fumbling for words, I sat across from her and took a sip of the lemonade. It was tart, a little too sweet, and it made my chest ache. We sat in silence for a while, just being there. Emma gave a small, bitter laugh. Sorry, I'm not exactly great company right now. You're fine, I said. You don't have to be anything. She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to trust my words. Everyone keeps saying it's time to move on, she said. Like grief has a deadline. There isn't one, I said without thinking. Some things stay with you forever. You just learn how to carry them. She stared at me for a long moment, and for a second I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded, almost imperceptibly. I finished my lemonade and stood, not wanting to overstay my welcome. If you need anything, just knock, I said again. She walked me to the door. As I stepped outside, she said softly, Thanks, Noah. I turned back and smiled. Any time, Emma. The door clicked shut behind me, but it didn't feel as heavy as before. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Small and fragile, but still fighting every day to keep going. I wasn't sure what would happen next. I hadn't planned anything. I didn't want to fix her or be a replacement. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. Something had shifted between that broken porch step and the silence in her living room. And for the first time since moving to Colorado, I didn't feel so alone. The storm came out of nowhere. One of those late summer thunderstorms in Colorado, heavy, loud, and fierce. The sky turned an eerie greenish hue, and the air felt charged, like it was buzzing with electricity. I was sitting by my window, watching the rain streak down the glass, when I noticed it. Emma's garage door was flapping wildly in the wind, barely clinging to its hinges. Without thinking, I grabbed my jacket and ran across the street, my boots splashing through the puddles already forming. When I reached her porch, I pounded on the door. Emma! I shouted over the howl of the wind. Your garage! The door swung open a second later. Emma stood there, barefoot in jeans and a worn sweater, her hair damp and plastered to her face. I know, she yelled back, trying to be heard. I couldn't get it closed. Stay inside, I said, waving her back. I'll handle it. Before she could argue, I turned and ran to the garage. The wind fought me every step, tugging at the door like it wanted to rip it clean off. I wrestled it back into place, jamming a piece of wood into the frame to hold it steady. It wasn't pretty, but it'd hold until the storm passed. By the time I got back to her porch, I was soaked to the bone, water dripping from my hair and clothes. Emma was waiting, holding a towel. She looked at me with a strange mix of gratitude and embarrassment. You're insane, she said, a slight laugh breaking through. Yeah, I said, shivering. You're welcome. She stepped aside to let me in, and I didn't argue. The storm outside was getting worse by the minute. Thunder rattled the windows, and the lights flickered briefly before settling into a dim, uneasy glow. Here, she said, handing me the towel. Come sit by the heater. I kicked off my boots and followed her to the living room, dripping water everywhere. She disappeared for a moment and came back with a sweater and sweatpants. They might be a bit big, she said, handing them to me, But at least they're dry. I didn't protest. In the bathroom, I peeled off my wet clothes and changed. The clothes smelled like her, clean, with a faint hint of lavender. When I came back, Emma was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked small, vulnerable. I sat in the armchair across from her, unsure what to say or do. For a few minutes we just listened to the storm, the rain pounding the roof, the occasional crack of thunder shaking the house. Then, out of nowhere, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm too young to be a widow," she said. I looked at her. She wasn't crying, wasn't even looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the window, the rain blurring the world outside. I stayed quiet, just listening. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Everyone thinks I'm strong," she said, almost to herself. "They say things like, you'll find someone else, or you're still young, you'll move on. Like it's that easy. Like it doesn't matter." I could feel the weight of her words, the rawness in them. "I don't want to move on," she said. "But I can't live in this emptiness either." I leaned forward in my seat, careful not to startle her, but wanting her to know she wasn't alone. She finally looked at me, really looked at me. Her eyes were glassy, but she held back the tears. "Not yet," she whispered, so softly I almost missed it. "Stay with me tonight." It wasn't desperate or pleading. It was just human, raw, real. Not about anything physical, not about something she wasn't ready for. It was about not being alone anymore. I nodded. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. "I'll stay." She gave a small, broken smile that hurt my chest more than anything else. I moved to the couch and sat beside her, careful not to crowd her. She leaned in slowly, hesitantly, like she wasn't sure I'd stay put. But I didn't move. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, and she rested her head on my chest. We stayed like that for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside. No words, no promises, just a quiet understanding between two broken people trying to hold each other together. The storm raged on outside, but Emma's living room felt warm, almost still. She hadn't moved in a while, her head resting on my chest. I could feel her breathing, shallow at first, then slowly deepening, evening out. I didn't dare move either. It wasn't about comfort, not for me. It was about being exactly where I needed to be. Minutes blurred into hours. Emma barely flinched when the occasional thunderclap shook the walls. Each time, I tightened my arm around her, a reflex, protective, like I could shield her from whatever she was carrying inside. At some point, the power went out. The lamps flickered and died, leaving only the soft glow of the fireplace and the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. I didn't mind. It felt right, somehow. Her breathing grew heavier against me, not from fear, but from exhaustion. She needed this, someone to lean on, even just for one night. I stayed awake the whole time, listening to the storm, watching the lightning dance across the room. Every now and then, Emma's grip on me tightened, even in her sleep. She was smaller than she seemed, fragile, like she was made of something that could break if you weren't careful. But beneath it all, there was strength, a quiet, stubborn will to keep going, to not let life crush her completely. I'm not sure how long we sat there. Maybe all night, maybe just a few hours. Time didn't matter. The storm finally began to ease around dawn. The thunder faded to a low rumble, and the rain softened to a steady drip against the windows. That's when Emma stirred. She shifted against me, blinking herself awake. For a split second she looked confused, like she'd forgotten where she was, or why she wasn't alone. Then she glanced up at me, her hair messy, her face puffy from sleep. Something shifted in her eyes, embarrassment, maybe shame. She sat up quickly, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice rough from sleep and something deeper. "I didn't mean to." "Don't," I said gently, cutting her off. She looked at me, startled. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "Not for needing someone." For a long moment she just stared at me, like she was trying to figure out if she could trust that, if it was safe to believe it. Her lips trembled slightly, and she looked away fast, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I'm not good at this," she said, almost laughing through it. "I'm not used to needing someone." "Yeah," I said softly. "Me neither." She gave me a faint but real smile. Then she stood, the blanket draped around her shoulders like a cape. "I'm gonna make some coffee," she said. "Want some?" "I'd kill for some," I said, joking, and she laughed, a real laugh, soft and breathy. I watched her pad into the kitchen, barefoot, the blanket trailing behind her. She moved carefully, like her body was still remembering how to feel alive. I stayed on the couch, feeling something shift inside me. Not pity, not obligation, something quieter, stronger. Respect, admiration, care. By the time she came back with 2 mugs, the sky outside had turned a pale gray, the first signs of morning creeping in. She handed me a cup and sat across from me, tucking her knees under the blanket. We sipped in silence for a few minutes. It wasn't awkward, it was comfortable, like the kind of quiet you share with someone when words aren't necessary anymore. After a while, she spoke again. "You don't have to stay," she said, her voice calm. "You probably have things to do." I shook my head. "Nothing more important than this." She smiled a little, looking down at her mug. "You're dangerous," she said softly. I raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous?" "For someone like me," she said. "Someone who's just figuring out how to stand again." I leaned forward, setting my coffee down. "I'm not here to knock you down, Emma," I said. "I'm here to help you up, if you'll let me." Her eyes welled up again, but this time she didn't wipe the tears away. She let them fall, silent and soft. And when she finally set her coffee down and reached for my hand, it felt like something sacred. Her fingers were cold at first, trembling slightly, but I held on gently. No pressure, no rush, just letting her set the pace. We sat there, hand in hand, as the world outside slowly woke up. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if she'd pull back or if fear would make her shut down again. But for now, she wasn't alone. And neither was I. The weeks that followed felt different. It was subtle at first. Emma waving from her porch when I got home from work, or her strolling over to ask if I needed a hand while I tinkered with my truck. Small gestures, little cracks in the wall she'd built around herself. I didn't push or chase. I was just there, a steady presence, a safe place for her to lean into when she wanted. Some days, she was quiet, lost in her own head. Other days, she smiled more easily, her voice soft and almost musical, like she was slowly remembering how to breathe again. We started spending more time together, drinking coffee on her porch, talking about everything and nothing. She opened up about her husband, David, how they'd met in college, built a life here in Colorado, and how it all fell apart so fast. There was no bitterness in her voice, just grief, and something else too, a quiet acceptance starting to take root. One Saturday afternoon, we drove to a small park just outside town. Emma had packed a picnic, and we spread a blanket by the lake. It was a perfect day, the sun bright, a light breeze cutting through the Colorado warmth. The kind of day that felt untouched by the rest of the world. We sat there for hours, watching ducks glide across the water, talking about the future in that vague, half-joking way people do when they're too scared to get serious. At some point, she went quiet. I turned to see her staring out at the lake, her face thoughtful. Then, without looking at me, she reached up and slipped her wedding ring off her finger. She held it in her hand for a long time, turning it over slowly, the sunlight catching the gold and making it gleam. "I'll always love him," she said softly. "He'll always be part of me." I stayed silent, knowing she wasn't finished. "But," she went on, her voice shaking just a little, "there's still a lot of life left. And I think he'd want me to live it." She closed her hand around the ring, pressing it to her chest for a moment. Then she carefully tucked it into a small pocket in her bag, and zipped it shut. When she finally looked at me, there were tears in her eyes, but something else too, something brighter. "Hope," she smiled, a real, beautiful smile that made my chest ache in the best way. "I'm ready," she said. "If you are." I didn't hesitate. I reached out and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the steady pulse beneath it. "I've been ready," I said quietly. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip lower over the lake. It wasn't the kind of love story you see in movies, not flashy or dramatic. It was slow, sometimes painful, but real. We didn't rush anything. We didn't need to. Over the next 6 months, we built something new, a different kind of life. Not a replacement for what she'd lost, but something that honored it while moving forward. We spent weekends fixing up her house together, taking day trips to hiking trails, exploring small towns, getting lost on purpose just to have an excuse to stay out later. We laughed more. We kissed, finally, A careful, tentative kiss one evening under the glow of her porch light as I walked her home. Later, much later, we talked about the future, the kind of life we could build together, without forcing it, just dreaming. One night, Emma reached over, took my hand and said, "I'm glad you stayed that night." I squeezed her hand gently. Me too. We didn't need to say more. In the end, it wasn't about saving each other. It was about finding the strength to keep living and choosing to do it together, not because we were broken, but because we'd found something worth rebuilding. Two people, two pasts, one future. The storm had passed. The house felt warm again. And for the first time in a long time, Emma and I weren't just surviving. We were living.